Good morning, everyone. This is Jody King with the Alaska PTAC. We are rapidly approaching our 10:30 start time, so let's go ahead and get started. What I'd like to do is start with the housekeeping and give a few more people time to sign in. So I want to call your attention to the GoToWebinar panel. The first thing I want to note is I have uploaded 2 handouts to the GoToWebinar panel for you. One is the copy of the slides, and the second one is a sample closeout checklist, just to kind of give you an idea of the different things that we're going to be talking about. So those are there for you to download. If for any reason you're unable to download those, such if you're on your tablet or your phone, you're always welcome to email me, and I'll be happy to send those documents out after the webinar today. The next thing I'd like to note is everyone joins muted, and we are going to be a small group today, and I really truly want to encourage questions and comments. The more discussion that we can have over the topic, I think the better webinar that we'll be able to present. Now, even though we've all been in this virtual space of communication for the last way over long year plus, many, many months, going on 2 years for some folks, please feel free to enter questions in the question box or simply raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you and you can go ahead and add comment if you don't feel like typing in that question and answer box. So again, let's encourage a lot of conversation, comments, add-ons, whatever you would like, and really move forward. I have a lot of information to cover. So with that in mind, I'm showing it's 10:30. Let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. This morning we're going to talk about contract closeout. And it really is the final step of successful project completion in contract administration. And like the contracting side of it, often it is pushed until the concept of when I have extra time, I'll deal with the contract closeout process. Now, I had taken I can't remember if it was a 2 or 3 day class with Management Concepts this past May on this topic, contract closeout. So I am willing to admit that I have borrowed heavily from their lesson plans. So our presentation today is going to be pretty word intensive on the screen. Not to worry though, I'm not going to be reading word for word on this, but what I wanted to leave you with is a lot of information. So those handouts should be really beneficial for you. Now, the management concepts workshop for contract closeout is geared specifically for contracting officers. So when I was taking this class, I was constantly thinking about, well, how would businesses hear this information and apply it to themselves? And truly, there is a pretty good one-to-one match. Some of the administrative matters are a little bit heavier for the agencies than possibly for the contracting officer. So what I've done where applicable is I've kind of done a side-by-side comparison, and you'll see that as we walk through. But truly, the steps that are outlined in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, about the contract closeout process really is valuable information that businesses should be applying to their government contract administration process as well. And again, we'll really talk about this going through. So the first 2/3 of this is going to be more specific, FAR-based, based on that management concepts class, where it really does tend to lean for practices for contracting officers. And then the last bit, we're going to swap over and talk about things that businesses should think of when they think of contract closeout that really don't apply to the contracting officers. So we have a lot to cover. And I'm really excited about this webinar. And I just want to thank everyone for joining this morning. And let's move on. Again, just a reminder, please feel free to share, comment, ask questions, raise your hand, put them in the question box, and let's have as much conversation as possible. So this is some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be going over the contract closeout procedures. We're going to talk about completing the scope and what does it mean by physical completion. We're going to talk about closeout timelines, who should be involved, the completion of a contract files, and of course, final payment. We're going to talk about record retention requirements, and then we're going to move into reviewing the costs. Is it truly the final payment? We're going to look at closing the books, those final subcontractor vendor invoices, lien releases, all of that is tied up into the final payment. And then last, we're going to talk about rolling up past performance reporting and reviews, archiving those narratives and that relationship maintenance. So that last bullet especially is really going to be focused more on the business side and not necessarily on the contracting officers. So definitions: closeout is a wrap-up of a completed contract involving review of the contract file, the taking of necessary action to close the file, and disposal of the file. It can begin when the contract has been physically completed. Although agencies specify their own administrative procedures for closeout, FAR 4.804-5 requires that the administrating office establish procedures that ensure that. And so we have a list of tasks that is identified in the FAR that must be part of the closeout process. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of this is the FAR direction is specifically geared toward the contracting staff. All of it is things that contractors and your project managers and your contract administrators on the business side should be thinking about for that closeout process. So of course, disposition of any classified materials, especially if you're working on a Department of Defense contract with all the requirements under the CMMC and the classified and unclassified materials. So this is definitely something to think about, especially as the CMMC 2.0 rolls out beginning of next year and winds up becoming applied to civilian agencies as well as the Department of Defense, where that security clearance process of handling that classified information needs to become part of our contract administrative process. So the final patent report is cleared when applicable. Royalty, again, when applicable. Value engineering change proposals, make sure that there's none that exist. So if you're submitting to the contracting officer while contract is in progress for a contract that you're working on, again, this is something that has to be resolved before the contract can be finally considered closed out. Clearance reports, property clearance, if you have any government-owned or government-provided equipment, is that returned? We'll talk more about all these different details as we go through. Interim disallowed costs, price revisions, subcontracts are settled. Those prior year indirect cost rates are settled. Again, we'll talk cost here more in a moment. That termination docket is completed. And again, that is kind of tying to this whole list when we talk about that termination docket. That contract audit is completed. Contractor's closing statement, contractor's final invoice, and of course, contract funds review is complete and all excess funds are deobligated. So that is really one of those things that are critical for the contracting officers, that they pull those excess funds off completed contracts, and if those funds are still accessible, if it's within that 1 year of the, let me get my tongue wrapped around this. So if we're in the same operating year, so if it was a short contract, we're still within that same year in which that contract was issued, those funds can then be deobligated from that closed contract and be reused within that agency's spending department. So not having excess funds sitting on the book is really helpful for the federal government. And often if a contracting officer is really on the ball, they're anxious to get that contract closed and get those funds returned back to the pot so that they can move those to a different project. But before, and this is kind of the last step, and again, we're going to talk about this when we talk about is it really your final invoice, of before we agree to have excess funds deobligated, have we really looked at all of our costs to make sure that, yes, those truly are extra funds and there's no other thing that needs to be resolved? And again, we're going to go into more details in that entire list. So physical completion. So it says closeout can only be performed on contracts that are physically complete. And here we have the FAR callout 4.804-4, where it defines that this requires a completion of all required deliveries. So all supplies have been inspected or accepted, all services have been performed and accepted, and all option provisions, if any, have expired, or all option provisions, if any, oh, I have that, should be completed. I have that in there twice, sorry about that. The government has given the contractor a notice of complete contract termination or the contract period has expired. So in what I should have said, all option provisions, if any, have been exercised. So if you have a multiple year contract that we're looking at the entirety of the duration of that contract, the completion of the physically complete. So a contract file cannot be closed if it is in litigation or under appeal, or if it's in a termination process. And so this whole contract closeout really has an entire separate line if a contract is in a termination process. And it really doesn't define if it means termination for convenience or termination for cause. And I'm not really going to address that. The processes are similar. It's just other factors that come into mind on that closeout process and that final negotiation for costs. So we're not going to really look at termination today, but I've left the language in there. So if you're ever looking at these slides down the road, you have that information. Hopefully, none of us ever have to face that termination for cause, but we all must be aware of part of that government contracting world. Termination for convenience is just that. That is one of the government directives. If they're no longer in need of that facility, service, those supplies, the process has changed, of course, government can always terminate for convenience. But whole nother workshop for another time. So let's move on. So closeout timelines. So again, here's the FAR language that's defining. So anything that's using the simplified acquisition procedures, and that dollar threshold was raised to the 250,000. So anything that falls under that FAR Part 13 are considered closed when the contracting officer receives evidence of receipt of property and final payment unless otherwise specified in agency regulations. So very short process. Now they still have to go through and do those same things that we saw here in the slides. They have to go through and still review the file, go through and check and make sure all of it. But the physical completion is much shorter. Simplified acquisition, Part 13, when the work is performed, final payment has been submitted to the contractor, we can go through and start the closeout process. So depending on the duration of that contract, it can happen very quickly and should. So a fixed price contract using other than simplified procedures should be closed within 6 months after receipt of evidence of physical completion. So here we have a timeline that it's recommended for the contracting officers that within 6 months of closing of that physical completion, that contract should be closed out. So for cost reimbursement types of contracts, so time and material reimbursable, cost plus, any of the cost plus fixed fees, incentive fees, all of those where there is that additional factor that we're thinking of where we're reimbursing as opposed to a fixed price where we've proposed that cost up front. In that case, those type of contracts that require settlement of indirect cost rates should be closed within 36 months of receipt of evidence. And the quick closeout procedures can be considered, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So 36 months seems like a long time, but what they're allowing for in these cases, the cost reimbursement, is for an audit of those final indirect rates, usually performed by DCMA that comes in and does an audit. Sometimes it's performed, a contractor can have a third party come in and do that audit, and then there's the process of getting that finalized and accepted by the government, and that becomes those absolute indirect costs instead of the forecasted that were built into your proposed cost, that difference then is paid, and that becomes the final payment for purposes of contract closeout. So all other contracts should be closed within 20 months of the month in which the contracting officer receives evidence of physical completion. And usually that's kind of tied back to that date of that final invoice, which in most cases should include a final receiving report as well. And so we can see that if we're talking about 20 months, 6 months, 20 months after that contract is completed, a lot of cases, those contracting officers have since moved on and are just working on the newest contracts to get out the door, to get executed, to get in progress, to administer, and then it becomes a revolving door of new contracts. And often that contract closeout process is delayed indefinitely. And I know from this class, I was the only one in the class that wasn't a contracting officer, that there really has been a push in the last several years for contracting officers to dedicate someone to becoming the closeout contracting officer. Some of the agencies, that's all they do. They are not part of the day-to-day administration or the award process, but they are getting the contract documents after, and their portion begins specifically for that contract closeout. And we'll talk about that when we go through a list of who all should be involved in the closeout process. But when we're looking at this from a business perspective, and if we're coming back to projects completed, 6 months later, 20 months later, 36 months later, we may not remember all of that information or processes or things that we want that either did not go well or did go well, of applying that towards our next projects. So on the contracting side of the house, it's important to remember that that contract closeout process, as we go through and we're looking at all these things that the agencies are required to do, that if we take these processes and apply them to our own business practices, that we want to gain this information to keep our lessons learned and applying that towards our next project, so that each process, each new contract has all of that value gained from the one completed added to our new, and we're moving forward with improved concepts. And again, more later. So accelerated closeout, or called quick closeout procedures. Mostly whenever you see this terminology, this is going to be applicable to those cost reimbursement contracts. And again, what it is it's a process of finalizing and negotiating how we're going to determine what that final indirect rate is, without necessarily waiting those 36 months to go through, so that we have a complete previous fiscal year to look at those indirect rates, do the math, do the audit, and have the actual rates as opposed to our estimated proposed rates. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. If this is something where you are involved on cost contracts, we spent hours on the accelerated closeout process in the management concept class, and I have worksheets on the different types of process. So if this is a world that your contracts are involved in, by all means, feel free to connect with me after the fact, and I'll be more than happy to share some of the management concept. In fact, I'd probably be willing to share that entire chapter on how they go through the formulas. So just real quick, the quick closeout procedures can only be used in contracts, so it's not geared towards purchase orders. And to kind of put it briefly, that purchase order is meant to be usually a 1-year contract activity, or it might be a commercial buy, might be considered a purchase order versus a contract. So again, quick closeouts can only be used on contracts, task orders, or delivery orders. It deviates from the normal procedure, as opposed to, in a nutshell, it's wanting to go through and finalize those final costs, negotiate them, find a practice that both the contracting officer accepts and the contractor accepts, and then apply that towards. So the contracting officer will decide if an audit of the contractor books or records is needed. There's a couple of different procedures that they can do. One, is this decrement factor method, and the other is a percentage method. But either way, should the contracting officer or the closeout contracting officer determine that this is the quick closeout procedure is beneficial for your contract, they should notify you in writing, and the letter should include a list of the contracts proposed for this process, the indirect costs for the preceding 3 years. So this, both the certified indirect and the settled indirect. So this is what we're proposing, this is what we're willing to take. So it's kind of the beginning of that let's negotiate process. And of course, those indirect costs covering the periods of performance for the referenced contracts. So, and this is pulled right out. It looks like it's the same thing, but truly this is that process. When we're doing a proposal, we're bidding our costs and we're building in those indirect rates, we are looking at our overhead, we're looking at those costs, and of course that percentage that we're adding in is based on the previous actual years, where we can kind of see a history of our cost of doing business and where it escalates. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on this. We have a lot of things to talk about, but just remember, should you run into this process and you are involved in a cost reimbursement type contract or time and material reimbursement, and you have questions on this, and you have an opportunity for this quick closeout as opposed to waiting those 36 months, again, feel free to reach out to contact me, and I really do have more information on it. I'll be happy to share, especially on how to use those two different methods. I just wanted to let you know that information is out there. So let's talk about who should be invited to the closeout party. So who else should be involved? So this is where I went through the list of all of the involved parties on the agency side and thought about, well, who would be that counterpart on the business side? So regardless of the organizational structure, the individual responsible, typo, for closing out the contract will be dealing with a variety of individuals performing the work and for gathering the data as needed from various internal and external sources. So for the agency, and this is where we're going to have the contracting officer, the administrative contractor, or the termination contractor. Usually the closeout contractor doesn't have its own acronym. They're just considered part of the administration closeout, administrative contracting officer team. We're going to have an auditor that will provide audit information for direct and indirect costs, indirect cost reimbursement contracts, cost and pricing data, incentive contracts, etc. They're going to have the property administrator discuss issues regarding title, disposition, and condition of contractor required government property or government furnished property under the contract. And so when we're talking about that government furnished property, equipment, so for example, if you're providing or have provided, your contract is now complete, that you had a help desk, an IT help desk, and they were on site, so they were using government furnished equipment, computers, maybe even desks, office space. So all of that was listed in the contract as that government furnished equipment has to therefore should be one, inventoried at the start of the contract, and you have someone that is responsible for maintaining. And then of course, as the contract is closed out, you now have that inventory to compare against. Now, if you, throughout the process of that said contract, wind up purchasing new equipment, new desks, replacement desks, new computers, that equipment, as purchased under federal funds, may become government property at the end of the contract. So in the case of construction, if you have extra materials that you had included in your cost versus having extra materials that you had there just as part of a contingency plan, but if the government paid for the entirety of that cost, in essence, the government then owns those materials and that extra equipment. And so you can enter into a negotiation process of how that said equipment is disposed. So in the case of the contractor that has the staff, as in the help desk, any equipment that was purchased as part of that contract performance, is that then again, was it purchased with government funds as identified in the contract, or was that the company's own equipment adding for their performance and it leaves with them. So those are the type of discussions that you might have with a property administrator. In a lot of cases for the agencies, especially here in Alaska, where we are not, where the agencies aren't necessarily centralized, the contracting offices down in the lower 48, they're all up here, the contracting officer may be responsible for all of these different roles, but something to think about. So of course, we're going to have information from that contracting officer representative or the technical representative or project officer, and those titles may vary depending upon the agency. There may be information from legal counsel. They can furnish information regarding patents, copyrights, licenses, warranties, and other legal concerns. We have the finance or fiscal, and in some cases that might be on the contracting officer side, or it might be on the program side for that individual responsible for the budget and the finance to determine status of payments, availability of funds, authorization to make final payments, etc. And in most cases, that's that relationship between the contracting officer and on the program side. Especially if we're coming through with final payments, there's been contract changes during the process of that contract, and there's been those requests for equitable adjustment to make up for change orders. So we need to make sure that all of those funds are available for that final payment. And of course, the receiving agent, and that may be different depending on the contract than the COR or that project liaison for that final receiving reports and documentation of acceptance or inspections. So agency side, and really, as we're talking about, that could be multiple hats worn by the same agency or same contracting officer. On the contracting side for businesses, for small businesses, it most likely is just one or two people wearing multiple hats. But each one of those aspects of need on the agency side should have a counterpart looking at the same information from the business side. So we're going to have our contract administrator or the business owner, and they're looking at the entirety of the contract file, communication, compliance. So all of that is involved in, did we do everything that we said we did? Have we invoiced? Is all of that taken care of so that we can go through that completion process? And so if we've done everything, we've taken care of everything, then should there be excess funds? Well, now we can talk de-obligation. But part of that team on the business side would also include either your chief financial officer or an accounting manager, because we're looking at those final costs versus proposed costs, including costs incurred from changes to the contract. So most contracts have some sort of change element, especially in 2020, when even the most simplistic contracts that we don't anticipate a lot of change for, so should we say janitorial contracts, where the work is fairly well identified, it has a lot of history of performance, there's usually not a whole lot of unexpected change, and ta-da, we now have a pandemic, and we have a tremendous amount of contract change with all of the health and safety and the additional cleaning requirements and those additional cost factors. So last year, 2020, and continuing into 2021, there were a lot of changes. And this is where looking at, did we include all of those cost changes, and has that been addressed in that final closeout process? So yes, parties to involve, contract administrator, our accounting team, auditors, and this is where, depending if the legal structure of your company, if you're a subsidiary on one of the ANCs where there's multiple companies and you have a parent company, maybe that audit can be done internally, or depending on the contract, you might want to hire an external auditor to come in and kind of help finalize and do an audit of your books for you to help you determine costs. So option, depending on that contract complexity, and of course it's a business decision if that role is needed. But for the businesses like the agency, there should be someone that's responsible for that property administration, the security clearance process. Are there IDs that need to be returned, need to be closed out? Because again, those security clearances are supposed to be contract centric and not just indefinite for the contracting officer. Our project managers, which are enacting that day-to-day activity of the completion of the contract, have that counterpart role working with that contracting officer representative or the technical rep So we should have the project manager involved. What was their comments? Do we have all their files? Do we have their information as well? Cost estimator, if that is a separate individual that has done all the ordering of supplies, because we're going to be looking at those proposed versus actual costs. Of course, our marketing professional, marketing leads, maybe we want to capture those narrative and close out what went well in our contracts so that we can apply it to future. And we're going to talk about that at the end of this presentation. Legal counsel, whether internal or external, is it needed for this particular activity? If you're looking at the same list that the contracting officer is looking at, you know, there are patents, copyrights, licenses, warranties, then maybe we should have that legal counsel. Is there anything, or at least a practice developed, if we don't have in-house legal counsel, to make sure that we're following through if any of that is applicable for your contract. And of course, one thing that is not on the agency list is subcontractor and other teaming partners. So as part of that contract closeout, do we have all of their final invoices, their final comments, and of course, write-ups, evaluations, and we'll talk about that again moving towards the end of the presentation. So let's talk about, we know who's invited to the party, but why do we need all of these people involved? And the reason being is, one, we need to have that completed contract file. And so far, 4.801, and I've just kind of summarized, that's the 3 dots here, is the requirement to establish files containing the records of all contractual actions. And the contract documentation is generally defined as written records of the individual activities that have taken place under the contract. It ranges from letters, and I kind of threw in there emails and text, invoices, to records of telephone conversations and acceptance reports. The purpose is to constitute a complete history of the contract. In particular, file documentation must be sufficient to provide complete background as a basis for informed decisions at each step in the acquisition process, support the actions taken. So again, that documentation supports why we did what we did, provides information for reviews and investigations, and it furnishes essential fact in the event of litigation or congressional inquiries. Now, hopefully for us on the business side, congressional inquiries is not anything that even is remotely on our horizon, but there is that fact of litigation, of potential litigation. And if you have maintained and you are good at maintaining all of those documents, communication, and we have an entire list, let's just move on to that. So in my management concept class, the list of items that should be in the contract file, the documentation, was 3 pages long. So I did not want to kind of hit you with the entirety of the list. So I've kind of broken it down into pre-award, post-award, and just highlighted to give you guys an idea. And it's still quite a list. Now, I'm not going to read all of these, but I wanted you to have that information. If it is important enough for the FAR to actually define, and again, that 4.801 defines that list, all 3 pages of it, of all the documentation that is required to have a complete contract file, I think it is noteworthy for us on that business side in the contractor world that if the agencies are required to have that type of information, we should too. And there's a lot of valuable information that can be gleaned from those contract files for use of improved performance for future contracts. So just quick, talking about on the agency side, of course, they have all the pre-award, the purchase request, acquisition planning. And this is before the documents that starts the whole proposal process, before we even see that on the street as a posted solicitation or a request to provide a bid or proposal from an agency. And kind of the counterpart flip of that is internally, as we see that solicitation, do we have a go, no go decision? And if we decided yes, obviously, because we're talking about contract closeout, we determined we're going to go ahead and go after that. What were those decision factors that you decided this was a contract worth pursuing? Back to the agency side, we have justifications, approvals, determinations and findings, evidence of availability of funds, set aside decisions, the estimate, copy of solicitation and all amendments, security requirements, evidence of required clearances, source selection, and the list continues. Back on that contractor side, we really do have, while it's not necessarily word for word exact, but we should, in our contract records, have a copy of the solicitation and all amendments. And often once it becomes a contract, it should be fairly identical. Of course, all your clauses, your provisions, sections L and M, section K, L and M, I believe, because the reps and certs, all of those fall off. But having that history of that solicitation document, especially if you have a complete file, possibly the next go around of the solicitation, you might want to have that history to be able to track changes. So even if you weren't awarded that particular solicitation, it's good to keep those solicitation documents in your proposed documents. So should it come up again, you have that information for comparative history. So back to our contractor list. Again, we want to have a copy of the solicitational amendments, those proposal working paper, the cost documents, quotes from potential subs and vendors, material estimates, wage and labor documentation. All of that is good, valuable information to keep and have a complete contract file. Now, when you're in performance, having those working papers and that proof of how you came to your proposed cost, should there be a contract change. In fact, I have a whole workshop on that coming up December 16th that you guys can look out for. You need to often go back to that working document to help establish what was that you had proposed and anticipated versus what are those costs of the change. So having that information already gathered, again, goes a long ways towards having that completed contract file for the closeout purpose. We also want, as part of the proposal working papers, we want those technical narratives, those past performance narrative, those key resume. So all of that documentation that we had taken time to build should all be part of that completed contract file. Teaming documentation, teaming agreements, etc. We can see the list down there. So again, award and performance from the agency side, we're talking about signed contracts, mods, if any, documents supporting contract modification, justifications approval, notice of award, any notices, stop work, the determination, the notice, the intent to award option year, all of that communication from agency to contractor should be in that contract file. And of course, the same should be said for the contractor. So I'm not going to read the agency list. Again, it's there for you guys to look at after the fact. But focusing on the contractor side, same thing. We need that signed contract and any modifications. We need to have that post-award certification, cost certification, and this isn't necessarily applicable to all contracts, but if you have any of that TINA, that certified cost or pricing data that you are supplying to the contracting officer post-award, that information as well should stay with your contract files. Any bid performance payment or other bond documents are reference to, notices to surety, insurance documentation, all required submittals. So if part of your contract completion was reports, status updates, progress notification, request for increase of funds, some contracts you have to notify them if you are at 75% of use of total funds. Any of that type of communication should all be maintained by the contractor. One last slide. So back to the contractor side, any of that daily performance data, field notebooks, time progress notes, requests by the CO or COR for potential contract changes, communications with your technical rep, your contracting officer's rep, the project manager, contract communication, any conversation that you've had with the agency, all of that should be gathered. And the reason we're talking about bringing all of these people to the party is because often they don't happen within the same space. So if your office has grown enough that you do have a full-time contract administrator, possibly even your office manager that's doing the administrative aspect of the contract versus the project manager himself, herself, that may be the one in the field working with the agency and completing that scope. So we have different activities. Of course, then we also have our accounting staff that may be doing all of our paying the vendors, paying the subcontractors, gathering those invoices. So we have different functions within our business entity, unless, again, mom and pop, and it's all you. And that's when we have to seriously look about, do we need to hire help? But we have those individuals that are all operating, doing their function, and those all need to come together and determine your process for your business. How are you going to ensure that you do have a complete contract file? How are those notes, data, whether it becomes paper copies that you bind in an actual file, or if you develop some sort of digital process, digital archiving process, then is accessible. Especially if you have turnover and you had a great project manager for that job, but has left state or moved on. Do you have their files? Do you have that? So let's think of a what if scenario. And of course, it mentioned potential litigation. So what if we had an unforeseen defect in a product, and we're within our warranty period, and the individual that installed that project or project manager moved on, and suddenly we need that information of how was it installed, how is it, because, and it could be something as simpler as, a part or component failed. Of course, now we have that manufacturer warranty that might be acceptable. Trying to make an example without assigning blame or cost, but that information needs to be accessible, and there has to be some continuity on that contractor side so that as people come and go in your business, and the same is said for the agency, as people come and go, there has to be that centralized source for all of this contract information so that as people do come and go and things come up, even if that contract is assumed to be physically complete, that the information is there and accessible. Phew, long soapbox moment. Let's move on. Questions, anybody? Again, I'm not going to go through, read the list. There's a lot of information on here. I'll just leave that for you to look at later. All right, so contract closeout procedures, basic closeout principles, concepts, and rules. So there's 5. Concept number 1, closeouts take time, which varies generally by contract type. And so for the contracting side of it, for the business side of it, it should be something that we are building in and allowing for that contract process, not just something we'll get to when we get to it, but building in that time to make sure that it is completed. Principle 2, no 2 contracts are the same. So our experience varies from agency to agency. And for the contracting officers, obviously it's going to vary depending on the business and the type of work. Number 3, reading is fundamental principle. Prior to conducting any closeout activity, the specialist must read the contract file from cover to cover, including all correspondence, vouchers, and other material in the file. Failure to perform this function may result in missing many important items and loss of substantial amounts of money. Now, I have a very specific story that ties back to this reading is fundamental. And I might even bring it up again, but I've worked with a lot of businesses that are a year, 2 years past the completion of their work, and they're still trying to get their final contract in, but not their final contract, I apologize, the final invoice. But not only are they trying to get their final invoice in, there was something that changed and they have these additional costs that they need to get into as well. But they're having difficulty proving that that request was there. Again, there was turnover in staff. The people that on the agency side are no longer, that requested these additional things are no longer there. And lo and behold, they don't have the proof of the request. They don't have any of the documentation to support that. So this reading is fundamental. So yes, it applies to both the agency, may result in substantial loss of money, but it's critical on your side, the business, the entity side as well. We do want to have that review of that contract because often there are things that happen in the flurry of that timeline of completion, and we might see an email or a request that we never then followed up with to have those additional funds. So reading is fundamental, really is applicable to both the contracting side for the agency and for the business. Inventory principle. It is imperative in reading and examining the contract file that the practitioner make a complete inventory of actions needing attention under the contract. Should have identified the source of action required as well as the date for completion. Again, I think that's applicable whether it's agency or for business. And the follow-up principle, which ties to your inventory, once a contract has been physically completed, it is seen by many as having fulfilled its need. Consequently, some individuals who will be contacted will not put your requested action on their priority list, with the possible exception of the cost plus fixed fee, because there's still more money tied to that. And that contractor is anxious to receive its withheld fee. The closeout specialist therefore must devise a follow-up system to ensure that follow-up requests are responded to in a timely manner. Now, the reason I put that in full in text, for even since most of the audience here is businesses, is we don't follow up. So again, like the one company that had all of this additional work that they did, it was just a short contract, they didn't follow up to verify that the work was completed, to get something in writing, to get anything from the technical, from the agency side. And here we are years later. And ultimately, I don't think they were ever able to recover those additional costs because there was no documentation. There was no follow-up at the time of, and all the parties involved with that, other than the business owner, had left. There was no way to even pull memory. So yes, part of that closeout inventory, what needs to be done, what is still outside of that completion bubble, and have a practice to follow up to make sure that items are not missed. So, area of special concern, and I'm running out of time, so I'm not really going to delve into this. And again, this was management's concept, and this is right out of the FAR. These areas of special concern that may make it difficult for the agency to close out the contract. So I've kind of have them in blue. We're just going to touch on them briefly, but I want to go through all of these as quick as possible. So additional funding, release of claims. So the additional funding, again, when we have those changes in the contract, such as now suddenly to have all of the PPE requirements, health and safety, all the additional things that were unexpected, those contract changes, which had additional costs that were recognized by the government, but does the agency, that program staff, have those additional funds? So that can actually tie up that contract closeout process while the agency goes and looks for the funds. And so if you have the case of a contractor that is coming back 2 or 3 years later and says, hey, I'm throwing this request for equitable adjustment in, we have these contract modifications, there's a cost associated, and those funds have since been closed and aren't necessarily available, there's a process behind the scenes of going through and capturing the funds from that particular fiscal year. It is not a quick process. And yes, it throws, I just forgot the phrase, but it throws a kink into the entire contracting process system. Release of claims. And this is really back, especially for cost reimbursement, time and material, construction, architect, engineering. Contractor signs a document stating that it has no additional claims against the government under the contract. Now, for those same business factors, often there is that release of claims that you are pulling. Not only are you providing to the agency, but you are in turn pulling that or requesting that information from your subs to make sure that all is resolved, going down that contracting tier before you're signing that release for the contracting officer. And then when there's multiple tiers, multiple levels, that release of claims process can, again, take time. And here in the corner of the screen, you guys can see I have an excerpt of release of claims, and it's just kind of an example of the language of a release statement. We have disposal of classified information. We have government provided identification and security clearances, and resolving that could again add difficulty in the closeout process. The final invoice, any potential liquidated damages, final technical reports that may be pending, patents and inventions, plant property clearance reports, price revision completions, and of course, release of contract funds. So if there were any withheld funds during the performance contract period, all of that could cause delay. And here, specifically, what they're talking about, this release of the contract funds on the agency side, is if there's any excess funds that have no claim to them, then of course there is that deobligation process for the contracting officer to go through and close out. And waiting on or working with the contractor again, as they're verifying that it's kind of part of that whole release process in my mind, is yes, we have been made whole, no additional funds are needed, and there may be delays as both sides are looking to see, are those funds truly excess and can they be deobligated? Royalty payments, subcontract settled by the contractor. If there is any dispute in costs between the prime and the sub, that can delay any closeout activity for the federal agency. Subcontracting plan, subcontracting provisions, and really that ties back into getting that into ESR, the esrs.gov website. Again, not time to really go into that. If you have questions on this process, feel free to reach out to me. Any value engineering changes, and of course, any warranty issues with contracts. So all areas of special concern that, again, were identified in the FAR for contracting officers to be aware of, and as such, really should be something that businesses are looking at as well. But just since we have limited time for today's webinar, I'm not going to go into details for each of one of those things listed, but I really did want to call that to your attention. Okay, duplicate payments. Don't forget, we have that FAR clause 52209 series 1 through 4. That whole responsibility matters from a business perspective. If you are overpaid, you have a responsibility to notify the federal government and allow them opportunity to let you know how they want that reimbursed, if at all, depending on how much was overpaid. But again, for the contracting officer, they really have to go through and verify that there have been no duplicate payments. And this last bullet kind of identifies, talks about how should they go about recovering that. Problem contract closeout. So this is an interesting one, and we spend a lot of time on this on management concepts as well. And I just wanted to pull this to your attention from a business perspective, because for a contracting officer, what do they do to close out a file if the contractor is no longer in business or has entered into bankruptcy? And there is actual steps, and each agency has guidance on what to do if this is the case, if they're dealing with a contractor that's entering into bankruptcy. And I know, and I don't even want to sound a little bit glib on this, so I apologize if speaking quickly I do, but we did have a lot of businesses that really suffered and not all made it through 2020 from pandemic. And so this was an actual issue of contractors unable to complete the process or perform bankruptcy, or even businesses that looking at bankruptcy process that didn't have contractors. But I just want to pull this out that it is identified, there is a process for contracting officers to go through from a legal concern should they find themselves in this situation when they're trying to close out a process. The biggest bullet that I want to call out is this firm fixed price contractor failed to submit final invoices. It says on occasion contractors complete performance but failed to submit an invoice. And this is where all my years in PTAC, I probably still get half a dozen a year businesses that call that they're trying to get that final payment in. It's been multiple years since that performance has been completed. A year to 3 years, and they are like, oh, hey, we found this invoice we never submitted, now we want to get it paid. Obviously, a contract from the agency perspective cannot be closed out until final payment is made. And so this sits open indefinitely. So as a business, I can't specify, I would think, due to cash flow, getting those final payments are really critical, but surprisingly, it is an issue. So not much to say there for the purpose of today's webinar, but I just wanted to point that out, make sure those final payments are submitted. Information on what to do if you cannot reconcile and that negotiated on final payments between the agency and the contracting officer. And again, I'm out of time, so I'm going to just leave this information. And should you find yourself in where you're at past and need guidance or need additional information on that negotiation for that final payment, especially if you have indirect rates that you're resolving, you're always welcome to reach out to PTAC, and I'll be happy to provide additional information on this topic. So, contractor performance. So part of the closeout process is completing that contractor performance. And so past performance information, including the ratings and supporting narratives regarding a contractor's actions under previously awarded contracts and or orders, is relevant for future source selection purposes. And this is right out of the language for the contracting officer. So it includes example of contractor's record of conforming to contract requirements, and of course, forecasting, controlling costs, adherence to contract schedules, reasonable and cooperative behavior, reporting into databases, integrity and business ethics, and business-like concern for the interest of the customer. So FAR 42 really has defined what all that means, and these are areas that should be addressed in past performance. And often, again, because everybody's looking at that next to-do item on their desk, the past performance information isn't completed. And it is identified, and this should be complete as part of that closeout process. Now, this is really for you all, for your benefit. I just went to the CPAR's website. The book talks about, completing that past performance assessment, and depending on the dollar amount, if applicable, getting that past performance information entered into CPAR's. And so I just wanted to find a screenshot of what are those rating categories for past performance. If you're curious and are looking for more information on CPAR's and rating process, I do have a recorded webinar that was done by Randy Miller on our PTAC website under training events and under on demand. And I'm going to request Randy to do that CPAR week workshop again, most likely in January. So just keep an eye out for that. So record retention requirements. And I'm truly out of time, so I'm not going to dig into the weeds at all. But what I've provided for you is a list of the documents that the agencies are required to keep and how long they have to keep it. Because again, there is that counterpart of agency documentation versus contractor. And what I've done, so this record retention by contractor, here is the information, depend on whether it was sealed bidding or if it was a negotiated contract. Here's the FAR language that defines how long should you keep those records. And in fact, I have a table here, it's built over 2 slides, that says, here's the document, here is how long you should maintain those documents as required by the FAR as part of your contract compliance. The only thing I didn't really get a chance to do is go in on all these labor, when we're talking about payroll, and make sure that the record retention period required in the FAR also matched the Department's labor requirement for maintaining wage records. Look at that, and if DOL is requiring that you keep those records longer than what's listed, then that's what you should implement for your record retention process. Okay, payroll sheets, material. So contract closeout from the contractor view. So in essence, we've completed the contract, we've complied with all terms and conditions, all legal matters are resolved, the closeout documents have been initiated by the agency, we've done our part, we've submitted them, we have all of the closeout documents obtained, the final settlement and payment's been done, all file records consolidated and contract closed. So woohoo, let's move on. But before we do, I have a few things I really would like to talk about, and I've kind of addressed somewhat. Let's talk about from an accounting perspective before you close the books. And in that final invoice, is it truly your final invoice? Have you looked at all your direct costs? Have all the invoices been identified? Have all your costs been captured? And this is where, when we talk about, who's invited to that closeout party, really, is there a good process within your company from the accounting perspective, the program manager, where you guys are sitting down and looking at, did you encapsulate everything? Were there unexpected expenses in the performance that may be reimbursable through a request to the contracting officer, through some sort of contract change action, or in the case of the pandemic, that there were costs incurred because now suddenly we had modification requirements that said, hey, now you have to do all of this for health and safety. So have those costs really been identified, and have they been added to a final bill? Have you gone through and done what you needed to do to request those additional funds? And if you have you invoiced them? So are all financial disputes resolved? Final is invoice submitted, paid. And this looks at, if you're in a prime sub relationship, not only your financial obligation to the government, or theirs to you, has that been resolved, but also down that mini tier of all of those invoices taken care of. Are there any questions, any comments, any concerns that could come back after the fact? And when we're talking about those lien releases, that acceptance of final payment submitted, received, if you're a construction company, have you gone in from that, again, that accounting perspective, and had that conversation to have that release from your surety company, so it's no longer holding its place against that, oh heavens, I'm running out of words, against your overall aggregate for your surety bond. Internal performance review. And I'm about out of time, but if you guys can give me about 2 more minutes, please. These last 2 slides are really let's look at and how to incorporate lessons learned from that contract we just completed. So was the company within your allowable variance, the proposed cost versus the actual cost, both your self-performance and subcontractor performance? How many of you all actually take a look at, okay, we just finished a job well done. Now let's compare and take a look at what happened versus what was proposed. In the construction world, I always think of it, we had our blueprints to build, and then we have our as-builts now that it's done and said. Where were the variances? Did we have areas we could improve? Did we have unexpected areas? Did we handle it well? Both time, cost, safety performance, employee performance. How did our staff do? Did we have any staff that really shine through this entire process? Should we look at increasing their information, their training, their potential for the next project? And again, lessons learned. We don't want to use that sub again. Well, when working with that COR, we need to change our practice. Maybe that individual is a bit more challenging, but we want those contracts from that particular agency, and we're likely to run into that individual again. What are those areas that had caused the headaches, caused the snarls that we had successfully gotten past? How did we do it? How well did it go? Looking backwards at what we've just completed in that contract and writing up those lessons learned and capturing that in our contract files are so critically important, and often it's challenging to do that from a time perspective. So archiving narratives. Why reinvent the wheel for each new proposal? And develop some sort of proposal archiving system to capture those technical proposal narratives, those key personnel resumes, those past performance packages. Again, on the PTAC on-demand training, we have how to build a resume master database that Lori Kropadelsky had presented. And I do have that recording, and it talks about just that, building an archiving system. Of course, that webinar just talks about from personnel resumes, but it's really great information that can be applied to all of the other technical components that you have taken the time to build for proposal to proposal. Compare proposed versus actual performance. And I've said this multiple times throughout, but it's amazing how many people are bidding using old numbers in their head, and they're not going backwards to look at what they've proposed versus what it actually cost. Many years ago, I worked for a civil engineer, and he would have his cost estimate and they'd do the work. And then I started tracking their hours, and their costs and comparing it against his proposal. And it found out that he was losing money, sometimes small amounts, sometimes large amounts, because he was maintaining his proposal process exactly the same from customer to customer without going back and looking at performance versus what was proposed. And once we started reviewing that after the completion, or even at stages in the completion, we could see where were the costs different than what we had proposed, so that we are maintaining profitable performance. All right, moving forward. So again, proposal wasn't awarded, request a debrief. And if you did receive the awards, again, request that debrief. Get that feedback from your proposal and compare it against your narratives to adjust it for future activities. So how did your project relationship end? And this is my last slide, and I apologize that I'm running over. That performance evaluation. So not only as an official CPAR reporting to use for past performance, but from a relationship concept, how did that relationship go? How did your performance, how did you get to know the contracting officer well throughout that activity? How are you going to maintain that for future contracts? So really, it's not just looking at, we did a job, we were paid, but looking at the entirety of our team and those relationships that we built during performance, maintaining that past the contract performance. Sure, the contract's closed, but those relationships are critical for future contracts, and you want to maintain them and keep that connection for future opportunity. And build some sort of process in place, and maybe it is part of encouraging those past performance write-ups, even if your contract was small enough that it's not necessarily qualified for a CPAR level of past performance evaluation. But even if you have a letter of recommendation or a questionnaire that you can provide, were you happy with our services? Where do you feel that we could perform? Any sort of satisfaction survey. Check back with the client after the project's done and said, how was our work? Did it hold up? Anything that's going to help build your name and keep that memory of your performance, so that when future opportunities come up, that conversation can continue. So I apologize, I ran over. I try very hard not to, but there was so very much information packed into a little tiny time period. Does anyone have any questions on that contract closeout process? It's simple in theory. We've completed performance, we're gathering our files, we're checking off that everything was paid, there's no litigation, there's no issues, we're good to go, move on to the next. But in practice, there's a lot of great little steps that can really benefit both the agency side, but benefit the contracting side as well for that contract